Hi, my name is Kim Yellow, and I'll be presenting my op-ed on restraints for people with disabilities. So I want to start off with the statistics that I got from the New York State website. According to one study, between 50 to 150 people die each year in the United States as a result of seclusion and restraint practices. Restraints are typically seen in various institutions, whether it be schools, nursing homes, hospitals, and jails, and it affects people or the vulnerable population the most. The big issue revolving around restraints is the legality and efficacy. There are various forms of restraints. So, CRDC defines physical restraints as a personal restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a person to move his or her torso, arms, legs, or head freely. CRDC defines mechanical restraint as the use of any device or equipment to restrict a student's freedom to move. The common forms of mechanical restraints are handcuffs, straitjackets, tape, straps, or tie-downs. A mechanical restraint does not include prescribed mechanical devices that compensate for orthopedic weakness to protect. Chemical restraints are any medication used to control behavior beyond the point of therapeutic benefit. Now that we know what restraints are, I want to get into the overview of the history of restraints. Restraints you can date back to the 1800s. The use has said to be for a patient's safety, to control behavior, protect individuals from falls, and prevent interference with treatment. Despite growing evidence of the risk of significant harm or death from their use. Around the 19th century, the first generation of American psychologists started to reform the mental health hospitals and asylums that existed around that time. They were following a new approach that was happening in Europe, which tried to move away from restraints. Americans decided that because of the aggression of American clients, they needed to keep restraints in order to control their behavior. Then the non-restraint movement regained stride in America in the 1980s, and the fight still continues today. The purpose of restraints, or the main purpose of restraints, is for the use to protect clients from harm. But according to the U.S. Ed, it states that physical restraints or seclusion should not be used except in situations where, in this case, the child's behavior poses imminent danger of serious physical harm to self or others. It's said that restraints should be avoided to the greatest extent possible without endangering the safety of students and staff. So, what are some of the risks? Going through various websites, reading numerous articles, they all kind of they all kind of have list the same risk factors, which is most cases, including the use of restraints on people with disabilities, actually tend to escalate the problem rather than de-escalate. So the idea of restraints was to keep people out of harm's way, but instead of it doing that, many times it exacerbates the problem. There is no There is also no evidence that using restraints is effective in reducing the occurrence of the problem behaviors. So in that moment, you may believe it's benefiting the person to restrain them down, but the problem, the quote unquote problem behaviors may continue because you're not actually therapeutically addressing the issue at hand. It has harmful consequences to both staff and clients. Clients and staff may be injured in the process, and in the more severe cases can lead to death. It also may reinforce aggressive behaviors because the staff use aggressive behaviors to restrain the clients in most incidents. So it's kind of just reinforcing that behavior over and over. Is counter therapeutic for clients, especially with trauma past. Medical providers recognize that placing a person in a restraint can be highly traumatic and work against the model of trauma informed care. And the one of the last risks that I like to address is the restraints tend to make the patients feel demeaned, and they may in turn respond with combative behavior, anger, or depression. So, an example of how using restraints could have a harmful effect on a client, the case of William Patrick. His death is listed as a therapeutic complication due to restraint. Patrick was involved in an argument with another resident at a state run group home. Staff stepped in to assist, but things escalated. It said that once staff stepped in, it further agitated Mr. Patrick. The workers pinned him down to restrain him. Mr. Patrick turned blue, passed out, and never regained consciousness. He died at 35 years old. A judge concluded that the excessive force by the two staff members led to his death, especially since in a previous case where Mr. Patrick had been restrained, he required CPR. So it made the judge question why the staff members continue to use this method to de escalate Mr. Patrick. So I just want to get into what my views are on using restraints, especially with people with disabilities. I think that when you review many of the cases, it heavily affects the vulnerable population. The money that you use to encourage these restraining practices, whether it be physical, mechanical, or chemical, could be used better to provide staff training so that they can understand how those strains affect the client, and that there are actually other alternatives that yield way better results, especially since the restraints can cause adverse trauma to the client. Yeah, I think that they need to look into how they can better educate their staff because while reviewing or doing my research, in many of the cases, the staff is overworked or they don't necessarily have all the skills needed to work with people with disabilities. And this was very clear in a case of Jonathan Carey, who was an autistic boy who was in a residential home in upstate New York, where he was restrained by the staff, physically restrained by the staff. And it actually resulted in his death. And one of the big things that kept coming up was that the staff member who restrained him was overworked, and he had also been fired from three different facilities working with people with disabilities. So it was a huge overlook in hiring him to begin with. So I think that as social workers or future social workers, it is important to be aware of some of the alternatives and other methods that could be used instead of using restraints with people with disabilities. It's important to use non physical skills, prevention, and de escalation techniques to reduce the restraints, reduce the need to use restraints. It's encouraged to have crisis management programs to provide staff with the skills and knowledge to recognize behavioral pattern cues, as well as environmental factors that may affect the client, so that you can better assist them before it even becomes a crisis. So you're able to pinpoint certain patterns that you know that the client may be getting agitated, and this is typically a time where you would bring in restraints. You could use de-escalation techniques and debriefing for both staff and clients so that they can assess the supports needed and the steps to be taken for that moment and for the future. Some other alternatives are to assess and other alternatives is to assess and eliminate other needs that may be causing the issue. So the second alternative I have listed is to develop and maintain consistent routines of care. Consistency in the routine and the de escalation skills is key to being able to manage the crisis at hand, as well as provide proper education and support to promote alternatives to restraints, which I discussed before. Work to educate institutions to reduce or relinquish the use of restraints. So, my hope is in the future that more institutions and agencies will begin to reduce the use of restraints to gain a restraint-free environment. With the increasing research showing the risk of restraints, it is important to continue education, educating people about the use of restraints and how it interrupts the therapeutic process. Thank you.